There are 5 workshops in the Writing at the Graduate Levels series. Each of these workshops includes a Blackboard component. If you decide to complete the Blackboard component, you will be eligible after all 5 for a Writing at the Graduate Level certificate. As you go along in this workshop, we have several moments in which we have reflections and questions for you to work on. It may be useful to keep out a pad of paper or an open Word document, as some of these reflections are actually part of the Blackboard activities. One of the most challenging things that any graduate student is asked to write has to be the research proposal. Why is it so challenging? I find, and I think a lot of other students as well, is that when we're working on a research proposal, we're supposed to have this coherent sort of vision of everything as it comes together. Yet, I find it very challenging to talk about what I'm going to do if I haven't done it yet. How am I supposed to communicate to someone else with such certainty that this is my research question, this is how I'm going to go about it? To me, it almost seems a little bit backwards, the proposal, because it has to be so tight and put together that it's almost like, well, just trust me on some things. But unfortunately, when you go to your committee with your research proposal, you can't say, well, just trust that I'll get to it later. So here are some tips, some strategies, some ways of kind of dealing with writing a research proposal, especially when we consider that we haven't done it yet, right? We have to talk with more certainty than we really have. So why do they make us write a research proposal if it's such a difficult task? If we know that it's a process and we're still going to be developing, changing our ideas? Well, there are a couple different reasons why they ask you to write a research proposal, whether it be for your master's or the more lengthy version for your PhD. One is they want to see if you've been listening to the conversation that's been happening around you. No, not where everyone's going out for a drink or how stressed everyone is. The scholarly conversation around you, being represented in other scholars on the topics, things you've been reading. They want to know that you can both listen to that conversation and you figure out a way in which you can join in. Another reason why they have you write a research proposal is because they want you to finish. Yes, think about it. Graduation. Isn't that exciting? So what they're looking for, as well as in a research proposal, is feasibility. Something that you can actually finish. And finish within the scale of time you have, within the resources you have. So this is part of how they're going to judge whether or not you have an appropriate research question, how you've conceptualized the information. Part of it is this feasible? Can we say you're prepared to do it? And furthermore, that this project is something that you can actually accomplish. So in some ways, it's sort of like a safety net. They have you write the research proposal just to make sure that that at least they can't foresee anything that's going to be in your way. So as we're going through looking at part of the structure of the proposal, we need to think about this audience of perhaps people who are on your committee. If you're applying for funding, this is a very broad kind of general committee of people. We have to think about what are the people who are reading this thinking? What are their goals? What are their concerns? And if we can start to try to address those along the way, then we can actually write a very strong research proposal. It's important to think about the needs of your reader, whether they be a committee who's going to give funding or your supervisor. The idea here is that we want to remember the reader and the reader's concerns. Often we're writing these documents, we're still exploring our ideas, and what happens here is, in fact, a moment in which we're writing for ourselves. So here are a couple things that you're going to want to keep in mind when you think about the needs of your reader. Often when we know the reader, like it's for your supervisor, we then assume that they have this vast variety of knowledge in the area, and that allows us to perhaps be maybe not sloppy, but we feel like we don't have to fill them in all the gaps. Well, actually, this isn't true. For all proposal writing, just like in many other situations, you should write for a reader who is not familiar with your work or discipline. There will be people on the committee for your dissertation or your thesis who may not be experts in all of the areas that you studied. Some may be experts in methodology, but others aren't. So we need to have sort of a balance so that all of the readers will understand and that they'll agree with your claims. Another key idea, I think, is just simplicity is best. Keep it simple. Be really straightforward. Why? Because the ideas we're presenting are so complex at the level that we're working at. They're not apparent. So rather than add complicated sentence structure on top of a complicated idea, clarity is really just going down, keeping it simple. Tied to the first 2 points here, we can really see an emphasis on defining key terms and concepts. At this point in your research, I bet you've probably read more articles than I could probably guess. And each one may use the term or concept slightly differently. So, as part of both setting out how you use the term, making sure everyone understands how you use the term, and even those unfamiliar with it understand it, define it. I also highly recommend that you consider your reader as perhaps not as they're not an expert, but as a non-major or undergraduate student. Right? They're supposed to be reading journal articles too. Your work isn't exclusively for experts. So get yourself, as you're working on it, instead of having a completely imaginary reader like an imaginary friend, grab a real friend, spouse, partner, anyone here, and talk to them about the ideas in your proposal. If they can understand it, then you know that you have done a good job and you've written for the reader. Another key point that will really help the reader both understand your proposal as a whole, but also the value of your project, is to construct a research question. Now, because I'm using the term research question does not mean that it must end in a question mark, but it's the idea of sort of setting up something that's more than a problem. A research question should go beyond a topic, because it should add, okay, what's the problem with this? Why is it significant? Why should anyone read this? So in this way, a research question takes your topic and operationalizes it into something that's studyable, that has boundaries, but also has significance. So strong proposals will go beyond a topic and actually demonstrate why we should care, how they're doing it. It's kind of like the thesis statement of the proposal world, the research questions. They don't expect you to be able to predict what happens. Haven't done the research yet, but to have narrowed down what you're trying to find out to a question. Once we have the question, now we kind of have a touchstone, a point to return to when looking at the other sections of the proposal. And I'm a very strong believer with tell them the research question first. Don't tell background, don't go into the literature. Really, second sentence of your proposal should be your research question. It is that important. It's going to ground everything else. But kind of moving away from the research question still can help us organize our literature review. Chances are most proposals will have a literature review or literature reviews throughout them. Often this is because you're setting up justifications for the way you use your methodology or theory. And remember, this is how you say, I've been listening to the conversation. My favorite question to keep in mind whenever I'm using sources, whether it be for literature review as a whole or just in your research proposal, is to try to remember that the way I use them needs to be a contribution. So in this way, I always challenge myself to answer the question, what does this paper or literature review tell me that I wouldn't know if I read all the sources? We're supposed to go beyond that, right? We're organizing it into a landscape, which means the key part of a literature review becomes its organization. What works do we bring together? What do we group? How do we even make sense of it? So when considering your literature review, some things you may want to keep in mind is develop a structure for organization. Do you have categories? Why do you naturally want to write about 2 articles together? And it shouldn't be that I read this one first and I read that one next, so therefore I think they go together. So consider that. Consider that part of the job of the literature review is to recognize that there are gaps, and that these gaps are not necessarily a bad thing because they're going to set up where you can fit in. But keep in mind that we want to deal with the contested territory. We want to say, here's where things aren't defined, and I'm going to contribute to that area. Also, don't be afraid to include, material that doesn't agree with your project. And don't just slash it and say, oh, it's horrible, terrible, they don't know what they're talking about. Rather, think about there's a value to it. Remember, they got published. So keep these in mind when you're looking at at your sources. And we're going to talk actually a little bit about how to even consider working with sources at the paragraph level and beyond that. So they may give you a little bit of a better idea of how you can work on building your literature review. When integrating sources into your proposal, one way to think about them is to look at them in terms of what are you doing at the paragraph level. The key thing here is to remember is that you don't want each paragraph to be a summary of one source. Rather, if our principle is we're adding something by organization, your goal should be to synthesize articles. What does this mean? This means that you're engaging with questions like, what are the similarities between authors' ideas or differences? Organizing material based on how you see them contributing to your own ideas or future project. Perhaps you're grouping them together because they support the same point or their studies were very similar. And you can also be saying they engage perhaps in supporting the same point, claim, or argument, but they do so in different ways, and that becomes fruitful for discussing how you're going to enter the field. When we go beyond the paragraph level and we start to look at this as a section, we can start considering using our sources very much in the same way as we kind of position ourselves within the department. Each of us are studying with a supervisor who is located within a department which is located into a faculty. These are all ways in which we orient ourselves to particular kinds of scholarship. Similarly, we can use particular questions to help us understand where our project is situated in the larger literature. How does our project relate to key ideas in the field? Are there particular key works in the field that address the topics that you're studying? Sort of your dream coffee date would be to be with what scholars? Is there a particular history or practice of approach? Has this practice perhaps changed? Were there sort of key moments in which it shifted in a different direction? Consider too, are there typical approaches to the topic? And are you using one? And if you're not, why? What is the goal or what is the expected outcome of doing something differently? And lastly, are there gaps? Are there places in which we can sort of fill in, much like sort of adding a brick to a wall? What is around it? What are the works that are around it that I can draw on? But what is missing, and what do I hope that my project will contribute to that gap?
I'm in the English department, and my dissertation is actually on English and drama, so I feel like I'm straddling both departments, which is an interesting place to be in. I'm hoping that this will open up possibilities for jobs in the future, of course, because I can apply to both English and drama departments, which would be great. But also, it broadens the areas in which I can teach, because it allows me to move from teaching things like Shakespeare to contemporary drama to drama from the Middle Ages to back to Victorian drama, etc. And I also can move into things that involve teaching survey of fiction or novel writing, etc., because all of those things are tied in, particularly with regards to the historical and theoretical timelines. So there are not that many people in my department who are doing what I do, though there's I think there's a master's student that's coming up that is also majoring in drama, and I think there's another incoming PhD. So maybe there's a few more of us that are also trying to be a little bit more multidisciplinary in this sense.
It's okay. We all do it. We all find a way to distract ourselves. Studies suggest that we'll even self-distract every 15 minutes. Sadly, I've actually realized when I've done it, 15 minutes, oh, distracted, oops. So we all have these things that can take up time. So why not recognize them? Heck, if we can recognize them, maybe we can find a way to kind of manage and control them. Just like you'll find that literature reviews are key sections of proposals, often there's also a method or methodology section. Now, what I've seen in many of the times that I've worked with graduate students is that there becomes this big emphasis on how. All the steps. I'm going to go to this newspaper or this area or talk to these people. And they have this great detailed approach of basically almost every step, and perhaps sometimes even going to the point of every possible contingency. This is great. But there's one thing that's missing there, and it's actually really crucial. Why are you using this method? Okay, maybe for you, you don't think it's so crucial yet, but why is important? What justifies your choice? What suggests that it will be either reliable, verifiable? What kind of validity will it have? And another thing to keep in mind is how, in terms of your method, how is that data going to help you answer the question that you set out? If you want to understand parental opinions on particular education policies, by talking to teachers won't necessarily get you that. It'll get you teachers' perspectives or teachers' interpretations of how educators speak. So sometimes the population or the way we go about it, sometimes just because it's perhaps hard to talk to minor children, other contexts like that, or okay, we can't go and fly across the world, we don't have funding to go study in that particular context, so we need to make do. But keep in mind that those need to be reflected both in the question. Your data should be able to answer your question, and also you should be justifying why you're making certain decisions. So this is where, again, you're going to find that you're going to be integrating sources and using them in your work. So when you go and you think about your methodology section, some of the questions you might want to ask yourself is, what makes this method feasible? How realistic is that you're going to get access to this group or to this location? Remember, part of the research proposal is making an argument for its feasibility, that you can do it within a certain amount of time. Are there limitations in your method? Are these big or small ones? Most methods and methodology do have limitations, but the key thing is to argue that these limitations are not going to affect the overall project. That yes, you aren't going to be able to do X, but X really wasn't important for what you were doing in the first place. In this way, just remember that your methodology section isn't sort of a how-to guide to your project, but rather it also includes why you've made these decisions. And this is where you can go back to other studies. So far, I think I've probably said the word claim or support so many times, right, that you're making an argument. I thought perhaps maybe it might be an idea to give you a sense of what do I mean by this. Often when we're writing proposals, we're ready to have a claim. We're ready to argue something. We're ready to say, you know what, this is the best methodology to approach this topic, which is great. We're going out there, we're being explicit. And we've got all that momentum, but we run right into a wall. The wall being the question. Why is it the best method? So with all of these claims, as great as they are, they get deflated if anyone challenges them. Right? Claims only work if the audience agrees with our assumption and doesn't question us. So here's a moment to think about how likely are your claims going to be questioned or probed by people on your committee? Pretty high, right? So what we need to do is we need to sort of take that claim and we need to add something to it to make it sort of like a superhero, the warrant. So in this case, what we always want to do is for every claim we make, we want to have a justification for it. We want to offer the reasoning for how we got there. You chose to do interviews, okay? Open-ended interviews. You will have a reason for doing that because it provides you with a particular kind of data, and that data is richer than perhaps using focus groups. That starts to build the warrant. And by ensuring that your claims are followed by reasoning, we start to we don't leave ourselves open for as many questions. Rather, we say, no, look, this is how I've done it. And we can then use a source, we can then justify why we've made particular selections along the way. So it's really important not to forget about the reasoning. It's great to claim that you're going to answer this gap in the literature, but you need to explain how and why your project will do that. So keep that in mind, that there's a two-part system here, right? You don't just want to tell people why it's important, you need to show them. How do you show them? Through your reasoning. And then you can make your claim and you can keep going and there'll be no wall because you're not just a claim anymore, you're a warrant. So now we've got the idea of how to argue, we've got an idea of how to sort of build up sections about methodology, how to address literature. There are a few other things that you want to keep in mind when structuring your proposal. Firstly is that, depending on your supervisor, your department, there may be particular guidelines that they want in the organization of your proposal. The reason they do this is they want to make sure people don't forget key or important things. Just keep in mind that if you're at sort of the fringes of your discipline, that you need to still keep in mind that the organization should be for the reader's understanding. So if you've sort of diverted from the typical project, you may have to ask permission or make sure it's okay, but you may have to divert from that traditional organization. Key here is that just because they sort of provide you with the template or perhaps sections to fill in, doesn't mean it can be choppy, lumpy kind of writing. We want to make sure that we have transition and flow. So the first thing when you're looking at structuring your proposal and you go back, what the reader should see first off is your research question. Get to the point. Get to the research question. Don't start off with the context. Don't start off with all sorts of lists. It should be the research question, which should include, right, what is my topic? What's the problem with it? That makes it interesting to research. And why should anyone care about it? That needs to come up quite at front. You say, oh no, it should go at the end. No, it's not the process at which you got to the research question. The research question will help the reader interpret every section, so it should be first. Also in your introduction, remember that. You don't want to just list out all the headings for the sections below. If you're going to include a summary of what is coming ahead, it should be functional. It should be more than the heading or title of each section. So if you're going to go there, make it substantive. Okay, You've done your introduction. You've laid that step down. Now, let's consider background. I know you're already thinking, but I was going to start with the background, not the research question. Background is often how we get interested in the topic. Sometimes it's a situation, a couple articles that set it up, and now, for us, this is always the platform of our project. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, that though that background is really important to our experience of the topic in developing, it's not as important to the reader. Really, it's not. Don't include tons and tons of background information. Think about what background information would be needed for the reader, and organize it by the principles, not of implicitly how we think it should be organized, but by the explicit principles of if someone else was starting off with your research questions, what would they need to know to move on? So in this way, we want to separate a bit from our process and include a very sparse amount of background. Remember, you're probably going to have a literature review about the topic anyway, so there are other places that information can come through. You're at the end. Isn't that exciting? You're at the end, often the conclusion. Now, because we tend to write from beginning to end, you don't have to, but we tend to, often our ideas have changed by the time we've reached the proposal. And this can lead us perhaps to a really common mistake, or a place that sort of opens us up to a lot of questions in meetings and stuff like that. In our conclusion, a lot of the times we have a new idea, we have a new spin, and we start to kind of address that in the conclusion, and then we say, okay, the end. What this does is actually opening a door for a whole bunch of questions about what you're talking about in the conclusion, and how does that now affect everything that came before it. So when looking at writing the conclusions, don't feel that this is the end of an epic, that everything must be tied together in a little bow. Rather, it should be kind of like the paragraph or two reminder. What were your key points? What were your claims? What were your justifications? And keep it very tight. So think about the conclusion not so much as this sort of dramatic ending or further explanation, but rather as here's a brief summary of everything that was coming beforehand, just in case people don't remember. So keep it short, don't add new material, particularly for proposals, because you don't want to start off asking new questions or opening up yourselves to, why are you doing that? How does this happen? We don't want to go there. We want the conclusion rather to say, here it is, 1, 2, 3, 4, that kind of idea. It's important to revise for organization when working on a proposal. Because our ideas may have changed by the time we reached our conclusion, but also because our reader will be reading it perhaps in an hour where it may have taken us days or weeks to write it. In this way, we don't really understand how to organize a proposal, perhaps till we've written it. Then we can start thinking about the ideal order of ideas. We can also look for repetition. Perhaps you've summarized the same source 3 times throughout your 40-page proposal. If so, then perhaps which one is best? Which one works the best for your argument? Can you see your project? Can you see how it's been justified and argued? If it's not matching what you felt were your intentions, perhaps it's a chance to look at, okay, maybe I'm not organizing it in the strongest way. So the key to doing this kind of revision would be to reverse outline. What is reverse outlining? Basically, it's like making a heading for every paragraph or subheading within your proposal. If you can determine easily what the topic of each paragraph is, for one, you know that you have coherence within your paragraphs, and 2, then you can sort of just look at this heading or subheading to see, okay, which one works best? Did I address it in 2 places? Is one better? That sort of idea. So rather than focusing on just sort of reading through and getting a sense of the organization in kind of a vague way, actually be really targeted about it. Look and create a skeleton based on, like looking in the mirror, right? Look in the mirror and see, okay, what are the key things that are reflected in my work? in this proposal. And that way you can actually look, by just looking at the headings and subheadings, you can sort of see your proposal in miniature. There are also some sort of general principles that you can use when you're considering looking back at the organization of your work, both at a sentence level and also at a paragraph level. It is easier to start with something that's short and move to long. So the shorter sentence, the shorter idea, even a shorter clause, is easier for the reader to start with before you go to the long. Similarly, it is best to start off with the simple, the basics, before you complicate it. So always think about simple to complex. And this really fits in with another idea, which is old. Start with the material that the reader is already familiar with before you bring in the new. So in these ways, we can see how we present information and build patterns often sort of starts with this idea of, okay, here is the older, and now we're building or creating new meaning on it. What may feel like a little bit of a conflict is, at the same time, we're geared to look for the most important information at the beginning of the paragraph. So the more important it is, it tends to be earlier, and the less important tends to be at the end. This is why topic sentences work so well. You can cue us to what the new information is, and then explain it by going back to the old and then the new. Also keep in mind that it's easier for people to understand sort of a general analysis or concept followed by a specific application, rather than the other way around, right? It's harder to understand if you give me this specific case and then try to prove a general rule from it. Syntax. Basically, this is a big fancy piece of jargon that refers to the order of words in your sentence. Now, you might go, this seems a little simple. Order of words in the sentence? Well, often what happens in graduate student writing, and particularly in proposal writing, is it's not that we write sentences that are grammatically incorrect, but rather we write sentences that are overly complicated or convoluted, that don't easily lend themselves to the reader. Therefore, what we want to do is keep in mind is actually constructing sentences based on the reader's needs. And this often means keeping it simple. Keeping it simple in terms of sentence writing is going back to that really basic model. Think a little bit like Dr. Seuss. The cat sat on the hat. Basically, the key thing is to ensure that we have both the combination of subject, action, object, and that our subject and action are close together. So, in practice, what this means is the subject, our cat, is the person doing the action. Right? What is the action? The action is sitting. The action, then, the sat, is being done to an object, to something, right? What's being sat on? The hat. Okay? So in basic, sort of simple ways, we've now got who does what to whom. Why does this matter in graduate writing? Often what happens is we start sentences with conditions. Sort of, if blah 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 blah, when, however, and this actually can delay the subject, what's going on, the person doing the action, and obscure them, making it very hard to understand the relationship between who is doing the action and what the action is. So when you see that you have a complicated sentence, one of the easiest things to do when you're revising it is to ask yourself is, where's the subject? And go back and say, okay, is the subject at the start of the sentence? And is the verb really close by? So keep in mind that just doing that can actually increase the clarity of your sentences. So if in doubt, the cat sat on the hat. Another common mistake that can happen with syntax, particularly when we're dealing with complex ideas, is that we get in the habit of starting our sentence with a list of results or factors. So we start off going, 122 degrees at the blah, 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 instead of saying, okay, what is this a list of? Is it a list of results? Is it a list of results? If so, for which experiment? So consider that, often where we put the list can confuse our readers. For example, if I were to suggest to you, separate them from whites and colors. Ensure that delicate items are appropriately packaged. You might go, what is she talking about? Well, I'm not telling you that this is my instructions for how to do laundry. In fact, I'm obscuring that. And if I left that to the end, just like your reader, you have to kind of go and think back, oh, she means doing laundry. Okay, now I understand whites from colors. I understand delicates appropriately packaged. So keep in mind that it's always best to tell people what the list is. What is it of? Before going into all the elements of it. Now, though it's not a technical term, this is how I describe a problem that I, for years, repeatedly made. I wrote my sentences backwards. What it was is I started with the information that was clearest in my head, and often this was a condition, a result. And I would start with this sort of condition, though blah, 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 and it would go on and on and on, and eventually I'd sort of end with the argument is made or something like that, a little short part. Well, really what happens is I was starting with the information that was in my head, that was easiest for me to write. But in fact, what I was doing, the subject, all of that got shifted to the end. For me, a lot easier to write. However, for the reader, it became challenging because basically I was asking them, remember this, remember this, remember this, remember this, remember this. This is why you should remember it. And at that last little section, they now have to go and recall everything that was at the first half of the sentence. So consider that, look at the sentence and saying, am I really starting with the key information or am I starting with a condition? So I learned now that if I'm starting a sentence and I start to go T, H, O, U, I know I'm going to write though, I stop myself because that was the key word for my backward sentences. And I go, okay, no. Who is doing what? Now, another thing that often gets talked about when it comes to writing is writing style. And I think that this is one of the things that actually gets confused quite a bit. We often think style is tied to, like clothing, our individuality, our personality. But when it comes to writing, particularly academic writing, style is actually, there are particular principles of good style. So it's not, oh, this is my writing style, actually is not a good reason for explaining a distinction of your work, let's say, from other academic pieces of work. So in this way, style is not individual, it's not about taste. There are actually certain principles. And actually, we can even think about this discussion as going back to E.B. White, the author of Charlotte's Webs, but also he was involved in one book called The Elements of Style, and this is how he defines style. Young writers often suppose that style is a garnish. He should begin by turning resolutely away from all devices that are popularly believed to indicate style. Approach to style is by way of plainness, simplicity, orderliness, sincerity. Basically, White is trying to say good style is about what makes it easier for the readers to understand. Clean, concise, well ordered. So in this way, we're going to go into some suggestions of ways to develop a strong style, particularly in the context of a proposal. Now, unless you're Michael J. Fox, you should be using the present tense for your proposal. We're not playing Back to the Future here. However, this is often what the first draft of a proposal reads like. We start off as if we're going to the future, right? I will do this. I will do that. Somewhere around the middle, We hit the present tense, often talking about particular work or people. So Smith argues, Watson defends, and then as we go towards the end of the proposal, we have proved, considered. All of a sudden, it's the past tense. Now, unfortunately, a proposal should not be a mystery story, so we shouldn't be starting with the future and have ending in the past. Yes, I know. You're talking about a future activity, but you can still use the present tense. Similarly, when talking about literature, even if it was written in 1959, we can still talk about it in the present tense because it's present for us, the reader. It does become challenging at points when you're working on your research methodology, trying to keep the present tense, but it's not impossible. And what this does is this adds coherence to your proposal. It adds a glue that carries through. Remember, though it may have taken you weeks to write the proposal, your reader's getting through it a lot faster, and we need to match the needs of the reader, not our own. A great example of what White is talking about when he means garnish, I'm sure he must have been thinking about the adverb. Adverbs are adjectives for verbs, and they tend to end in ly. And if we're talking conversationally, it works out well because adverbs give us a great point to sort of stress the importance of an idea or sort of give a sense of how, in terms of our tone, what we mean. So in this case, I can say, oh, I'm really tired of writing my proposal. Really lets me give that emphasis. I can say things like, this is a strongly held belief. However, when we read the text and we write it out, this does not come across because we don't have intonation. We can't stress it with our voices. So a strongly held belief does not read actually well. Having a held belief and its brevity is actually stronger. So it's key to get rid of the adverbs unless they add a particular meaning to your sentence. So sometimes we want to add ones that say we want to modify our claim so that we don't think that we're including everyone. So generally, graduate students struggle with proposal writing. Just in case, we want to accommodate for those students who don't, right? We don't want to be making absolute generalizations. But there is no reason to ever use the word very again in your writing, unless you are going to spread it out like you're talking and you're going to go, oh, this is very difficult. So one way to do this is just to go to find replace, type in ly, and start deleting. Be brutal. Get rid of the adverbs. Trust me, it's better to use a good verb than to use an adverb. And speaking of good verbs, what are good verbs? Verbs that are really powerful are those that tell us of an action. So we can have a habit of writing and we can use state of being verbs like is, has, were, are. Now these just say this is what is. It doesn't actually have an action. So if we use verbs that are action vague like propose, posit, ponder, we actually have activity going on in our sentences. Plus, when we have these active verbs, we tend to be more concise because this one verb gives us a lot more punch. So if we say proposes and say the student proposes that, this is much stronger than saying the student is considering the proposal. See, it gets so much more complicated. So look for action verbs. If we add them in, we'll be more concise. And remember, when it comes to English composition, verbs mean everything. As I keep learning about writing, the one thing that keeps coming across is if you're writing for a reader, use strong verbs. A good verb can overcome and sort of supplement adverbs, adjectives. So really think about what kind of words are you choosing and choose those strong verbs. Another thing to consider, we talked about choosing verbs, but we should consider our word choice overall anytime we're dealing with literature. Because First of all, we want to be really accurate in the way that we talk about previous work in the field. And we don't want to be sort of a slip-in word choice to perhaps alter the meaning of the original work. So at some points, you may want to consider the connotation of a word. Connotation meaning not what it actually says, let's say, in the dictionary, but how it has been used overall, perhaps in the field. So it's great to say that you offer competent care, but for the general public, competent care, actually just being competent isn't a good thing. There's a negative association. However, if I'm writing to a nursing audience, which very much focuses on teaching and maintaining competencies, this word is fine. So keep the idea that different contexts does not mean the word means the same thing. So if we're writing for a general reader and not someone who's specific into the discipline, we may have to talk about what do we mean by competent care, so by offering a definition, or we may have to change the word that we're using. Because in proposals, we're really setting out stakes based on what we think, what our arguments or our contributions to the field going to be, we may want to include phrases like, I think that, I argue that, I support that. In all of these cases, we have perfectly good, strong sentences hanging out after the that. I think that dogs are better than cats. Because I'm the author, I really don't need to assert myself in the I think. It's stronger to say cats are better than dogs, particularly because we know we're going to follow that claim up with the reasoning. So if you have a habit or it helps you facilitate the drafting process of writing I think that, I argue that, I propose that, we can get rid of everything that comes before the that. The situations in which we want to maintain the that are when we're going to attribute an idea to someone else. So when Smith argues, Watson deducts, these are all situations that are likely going to be followed with that. And it's okay. But because we're the author, we do not need to attribute ideas to ourselves. It's associated that what we're writing and what we're presenting is in fact our own work, our own opinions, our own arguments. And lastly, of all the tips for style, one key thing to remember when it's academic writing is academic style is formal. Yes, it's time to suit up. This means no contractions. This means don't add a joke in there. And also that we should be writing in the sort of concise, clear, tight style because we don't want to be considered chatty. So in this way, imagine it's sort of a job interview. We're going to have a very formal sense of discussion, a formal presence, rather than perhaps chatting with our friend. So keep that in mind as part of the overall style. Does it sound like you're talking to them, chatting on the phone or texting, or does it sound like you're in a suit and you're presenting to a boardroom? Often when we're working on our proposals, we're at the beginning of projects, and it's a great time to take advantage of some of the new technology that's offered there. EndNote, Mendeley, whatever is your your choice, they offer a great resource for tracking, for helping you build your literature reviews. It's one of the things that I wish I actually had taken advantage of at the beginning of my graduate career. I think it would have been really useful. It's hard to do it retroactively and going back through all that you've read. But there is one thing that I want to make sure that everyone's aware of, particularly when we consider citation and that sort of formal occasion. It's a formal occasion, right? We want to have perfect whatever citation style we pick. EndNote, Zotero, doesn't matter which one you name, they offer great tracking and they do a good job of inputting information. But, here's my but. Unfortunately, they are not perfect when it comes to citation styles. In many ways, it's not the program's fault. It's based on the metadata of the journal. So if you are working on sort of health society from a social science perspective and you plan to use APA, you need to be aware of that the style that you're going to get most of the metadata that your citations are based on will be that of Vancouver. The problem with them being in Vancouver and what will happen to your metadata is, regardless of the way in which they organize the information, is Vancouver uses abbreviations for all the journal names. These abbreviations will pop up in your APA citations regardless of if you use RefWorks, EndNotes, Vancouver. So keep in mind that when you're importing the data that you're going to have to go through and look at, and when you're looking at it, to make sure that you write the full titles out. So keep in mind that you wouldn't let a computer write your proposal, so don't let it necessarily write all your citations. It's important to check, right? You wouldn't want to show up to a job interview with a stain on your tie. Similarly, you don't want to submit your proposal with a simple citation mistake.
In any proposal, you must convince the reader that you know what you're doing. Whether you're submitting your proposal to a grant committee or your department, you don't want to sound unsure or unsteady in your project. In the former case, you won't receive the grant. The committee is looking for someone who has a project with a plan, direction, and expected outcome. They need to see that you will finish it on time and make it worth their while to fund you. In the latter case, your department or supervisor may need you to revise your proposal if your project sounds like it isn't going to work. You may have an excellent idea and direction, but unless you put that idea down on paper properly, you're not going to get the credit you deserve.
The last word I want to leave you with on proposals is to keep the idea that this is a long process and that it does take time. Proposals often come with revisions, revisions come with more revisions, because it becomes the way in which you dialogue with both your supervisor and your committee. Don't focus on finishing your proposal, getting it done. Rather, the proposal is just a starting point. The proposal gets revised because your ideas change. In many ways, the proposal grows and shifts just as your project does. So rather than focusing on and perhaps getting daunted by the fact that you feel like you're done, no you're not done, no you're not done, keep in mind that this is a process, and maybe as you're taking this long walk through the process, that you should take time to stop and enjoy the view. Enjoy that your ideas are changing. It'd be really boring if they all stayed the same. Enjoy the fact that what you're doing is interesting enough that your supervisor and other scholars at the university are engaged with it enough to give you suggestions on where to go. This is part of the exciting, this is the benefit of graduate school. And if we can reframe it in this way and think about it as an exciting discussion rather than, I have to do another draft, we may be able to keep up the momentum and enjoy the process of proposal writing.